apparently it's net zero, which is remarkable. It's the biggest, according to its own, stats. It's the biggest building of that size that's also net zero. But it's also beautiful, and also they do a great job of communicating what they're doing and why and how it works. And I think it's a very big success, design-wise, sustainability-wise. And they talked about the challenges they faced getting permits and making it happen. And the city of Silver Spring made it happen. And so where there's a will, there's a way, and that includes redevelopment projects in the middle of a city. So with that said, our building, we're going to invest $60,000 to enroll the convention center in the green switch match, and that will offset 80% of the emissions of the building. And we're also excited to continue Climate Council discussions on KUB's investment in 502 megawatts of new solar through the Green Invest, and that has put our city on the map as the top city in the Southeast for investing in solar power. And we're also working with KUB to place a new community solar project next to the City Public Works Service Center on Morris Avenue. And I mentioned that because obviously the 502 megawatts of solar is the bigger sustainability gain in the metrics. But what people will notice right here in Knoxville, and everyone who is going through our city, they will notice more and more that visible solar project next to the City Public Works complex. So both are needed. We need the big numbers, the metrics that's actually changing our emissions in a big way, but the smaller, highly visible projects I think are also really important. So with that said, I want to turn it over to Brian to sort of lead us through the next steps of this process and where we're going from here. Brian.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to pull slides up, and while I'm doing that, I'm glad you mentioned the net zero building. Grace and I were actually on a DOE call this morning about their low carbon pilot, and I can discuss it because they're actually announcing it at the Better Building Summit. But we enrolled to, in the next 2 years, try to take 2 city facilities and make them net zero carbon. And so we're looking at a fire station and a rec center, and they're looking for scalability and replicability, and they want practical buildings. So when I said, we might not be able to bring some gigantic facility to the table, but would you put up with a fire station? And they said, oh yeah, there's more fire stations out there that we need a path and an example for. So they're going to recognize us, and we're one of 4 municipalities that are enrolled in that. We're up there with City of Orlando, which is a fantastic person to be worked with. Can everyone see the slides here? Perfect. So just a rough run through of today. I hope everyone had a chance to look through the work plan. I know it came in a little bit late on Friday. This is not the last point for you to weigh in on it, but we'll talk through kind of the nuts and bolts and the sausage making that went into the work plan development, and then have plenty of time for pauses and discussions. I want to start in with a review of the past year. It's been a while since we met, and it was a very quick pace and a lot of meetings and a lot of information. So just kind of revisit some of these goals and where we started out, and really give some perspective on how far we've come with the work plan. And then again, we'll get to that sausage making. I'm going to try to pause as much as I can, but I know that you all have some technical questions that I didn't feel would be conducive to a very broadly applicable document. But I did want to share those insights with you all and have you have a chance to comment on that. So the Climate Council, our role. This should be a familiar slide. I think it was in every single presentation that we talked through. And it's kind of the 3 tenets that we're starting out on. And this overarching idea that we're going to address community emissions 80% by 2050, identify and prioritize those, discuss opportunities and challenges, and then make recommendations that'll feed into the work plan. So this is significant, and to give a little bit of perspective on it, in the past, our work plan, I would say, skewed pretty heavily towards operational activities and less on some of the harder to drive community actions. And we've flip that this year. So in this work plan visioning, whenever we started thinking that 80%, we knew that it was going to need to be the focus. Operational emissions are well ahead of the curve. We're doing great operationally. Community emissions are lagging behind and really headed in the wrong direction. So I wanted to make sure that if we're playing one note, that's a very clear note and it's distinct, and really try to hone in and make this kind of an educational visioning process, as well as setting some functional priorities for the city to sink its teeth into and try to drive this. And what this wasn't the process, we've tried to mention this throughout, and just reiterating as you've seen the work plan, this is not a list of shovel ready projects. It's not a compendium of line items, budgetary line items that are going to reduce emissions. This sets, whenever we were evaluating this process, if you recall, we brought in USDN and we talked about these strategies, and there's some that the city can move and some that are going to need to be led by private industry, and the working groups kind of unpacked, where that responsibility they felt like should lie, whether that's publicly funded or privately funded. And what I felt whenever we were going through this, and one thing that I heard was we needed a coherent message that was salient. So, what do we value here as Knoxville that isn't Portland, Oakland, even though that those are role models to look to in terms of planning? We recognize that we may not have the same infrastructure for personnel or the infrastructure in terms of departmental influence. So what is critical as we advance this? And we'll unpack that a little bit more. So again, just touching on this, got a little bit ahead of myself there, but the HIPs were not the blueprint to achieve the goals. Where we started was not the blueprint. And this plan is not, I would urge you, while it does chart a path that puts us on that trajectory, I would not say that it is a blueprint to get us there. Again, not shovel-ready projects, but it will inform shovel-ready projects. And these are not all mitigation. There are tweaks. We had to figure out what we prioritize more. Is it bigger savings in homes or more homes? What parts of public transit are we thinking about? All these sorts of influences are things that you all chewed on. And so hopefully this is jarring a little bit of those memories from those conversations as we move into it. I would say the past year has been wildly successful, especially as I've looked and compared it to other plans and the amount of people that they involved in the process. Between the Climate Council and the working groups, we had 65 participants that were on a meeting. That's not counting that person that got on a meeting and went and talked to a committee that they're on, or their staff, and those people subsequently followed up with our staff to provide input. Or I know several of you forwarded surveys onto your staff to comment, and you had several people filling out these blocks. So that's just 65 people that were on calls, speaking, participating, filling out the paperwork for larger teams. We had over 35 community organizations. We had 20 meetings. I'll say over the past year, but most of those happened within a 9-month time frame. So a lot of discussions. And then for the public input sort of piece, this has been step one of a larger conversation, but through several surveys, we've had more than 508 responses on various feeders into this plan. They typically focus on that lived experience. How do you interact with these systems? What do you prioritize as a resident and an individual? And then those informed both the equity working group and obviously our staff, and how we curated the list of priorities and strategies that you're going to see in that work plan. I'm going to introduce this, and we're going to circle back on it. This is kind of a bookend thing, but what I would recommend is view the work plan as the visioning document. Going back to how we started into this conversation, the way that we approached it, we were setting this high level vision of priorities. What I would say, that is not the end step. What we need to do now is, barring any major disagreements or major misalignment, as we discussed today, I think a next step is we go public, and I would recommend that we engage city council. If they have an interest in a workshop, that's something that we would need to discuss. But if they have an interest in a workshop, we could do a workshop, or we could do an update to city council. But I think we should talk about these priorities, and to some of your concerns about how that sort of information influences budgets and decision making in the future. I think that's a pretty critical step. And then once we've set the trajectory on this vision, I would like to go to our website and fill in a lot of the more technical details. I think the work plan itself sets a really good, generally approachable way to introduce you to the concepts and what we value as Knoxville as leaders in this space. But it's not a very dynamic way to interact with it. There are a lot of things that data sets that we might be able to update more frequently. Whenever we'll go through a simple spread, but there's a measuring success where we look at other performance indicators rather than trying to fine tune a work plan and do a lot of wordsmithing and design and worrying about, tracking and kerning and leading and, how all the letter spacing and all that works out on a page. I would say my next step, once approved, is to completely redesign the sustainability webpage and start embedding this language there, aligning how we talk about the sectors as our webpage and have it mirror, but also add more detail. Let's expand on those performance indicators in a more dynamic, easier to change for staff location. And that'll also give us an opportunity to highlight and amplify some of those programs that our partners are driving as well. So this is one of the points where I'd love to hear your feedback. So feel free to unmute and chime in, or do you have questions about the process, what you've heard about the multi-pronged approach and if you don't, we'll circle back on that. We've got more of that later as well. Otherwise, next we're moving to the priorities and the evaluation of those.
Well, Brian, I'll just say that I do think that, once the work plan is refined and so forth, getting that out to the public and having sort of dashboards or other ways to measure our progress or lack of progress, and where, to help, that transparency is really important and motivating. So I think that would be a great next step.
Thank you, Mayor. And I think for those of you that have explored our webpage in the past year or so, one of the things that we've added is disclosing our emissions. There are a lot of things that we publicly disclose, but they're on some obscure portal. And so my team has been working to just get that data, whether it's raw data or visual, but giving multiple ways for people to digest it that are interested in it and giving that information to folks. So that's kind of how I see these performance indicators.
Hey, Brian, question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Stan.
This is Stan Johnson. What do you think of the goal of 20? Where are we at? Did we chip at it this year? What was the percentage of carbon emissions that was cut by the standards that we've done already? And where are we at right now is my question.
We'll discuss that in the next section. One thing that I'll say, in terms of emissions, I did not do an updated community. 2020 was kind of an aberration with COVID. So I wouldn't really compare that to a normal year. But what I would say is a lot of the data sets that we have to rely on don't update on an annual basis. There's a lot of metrics that we get, especially from federal sources like the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, that don't come but like every 2 to 3 years. So I would keep that same cadence for updating community emissions.
Brian, can you clarify what you mean by metrics and indicators beyond just climate mitigation, and who would be involved in the development of those metrics and indicators?
Yeah, the metrics for success, or the measuring success sort of portion, That came from the stakeholders in this process. Everything that you see in the work plan, there's a table on the right-hand side and there's a measuring success. Every one of those was plucked from surveys and feedback throughout this process. Now, those are tracking mitigation. I know the equity working group also set some principles that are reflected kind of overarching in the narrative, but the KPIs or key performance indicators in the tables that came from the technical working groups and Climate Council.
So equity metrics and indicators are still to be developed and integrated into this process?
If the equity working group, in the memo that was provided, there weren't any equity performance indicators. There were some considerations, and I'm more than open to attaching the memo that was sent as an appendix to the work plan as well for context. But yeah, I mean, if there are other metrics that we wanted to add, as long as we can get our hands on them and publish them. We just took everything that had, I think it was like 3 or more votes on a metric, had some sort of consensus from folks that were responding, or at least was bubbling to the top as a popular option, and that's what we used. So if there's
I have a concern just in terms of, as these, as you said, some of the projects are not shovel ready, yeah. So as they become more defined and refined, at that point, as an evaluator, I would suggest developing specific project level evaluation criteria, metrics, and indicators for measuring impacts, both positive and negative, at the community levels. So I'm just curious how that process would work ongoing as these specific projects become operationalized.
If the equity working group would like to continue to discuss that and give some guidance on it, I'm not opposed to anything. Again, I mean, the memo from the equity working group of a year of discussion, I'm working off what they delivered as their key message to me, which, the entire process was essentially designed by the equity working group, and obviously you were a critical part of that. So if you want to reconvene and give those, I mean, that dynamic environment of going to the website, I don't see any problem adding to that and having those sort of metrics. And if there are additional guidelines, I know that you and I had some very specific discussions about the evaluation or assessment questions that you used. I mean, if you have some more specific guidance as it relates to those sorts of assessment questions, I'm open to discussing them.
I think as it became clear that these strategies were going to be at a pretty high level, the equity working group kind of reorganized in terms of how it could screen at that level that this group was at this particular point in time. And I think it was understood that as these projects become more defined and localized to different neighborhoods, that there would still be opportunity for the equity working group members to participate in, okay, now that we know what we're actually doing on the ground, how do we measure those impacts? So although it wasn't in the memo, which was catered to, this high level place that we're at today, moving forward, I think it's going to be critical to keep engaged with equity working group members in that vein.
Yeah, I think we're in alignment there. And I mean, let's be completely transparent here, Erin. I've worked with your team to endorse a proposal that would continue funding those equity working group discussions. So we're committed to it. We want to continue that work. But I've been very hands off. I know that, again, to be fully transparent, a lot of the members of the equity working group sent a letter to us in February of last year with some very specific parameters about what they would consider success. And essentially, I feel as though I threw the keys and gave a lot of latitude. So I'm open to continuing that discussion, open to adding those metrics. And I think that we should definitely 100% continue those conversations. We need to find a way to maybe find some grants or ways that can be more autonomously supported as well. But I'm certainly open to finding ways to support it financially on our end too, just like we've provided some match for the grants to support you all. Does that help clarify? Cool, thanks. Dr. Smith, did you have a question?
Well,
or comment?
it may be coming up later. I guess I was just, you had mentioned interacting with the city council, and I was just curious about sort of the current thinking about timing of this going public and how, sort of how you envision engaging with the city council. Obviously, they've got to vote on the budget next week, as was mentioned by the mayor. But then, do you have a sense of the timing of sort of doing a sort of a deeper dive or making available to them, some of the elements of this? And then obviously at that point, it's going to be in the public domain, I would imagine. So the question is sort of, what is your sense on how that rolls out timing wise?
Yeah, great question. Purely on the document side, best case scenario, let's say everyone felt pretty good with it. I know that there's some design and like small tweaks that need to happen. Punctuation, grammatical stuff that, crept through, just trying to get you all a draft before the weekend. And just knowing our designer's workload, it'd probably be mid to late June before we were able to get that finalized. So I'd say it'd probably be next fiscal year before we could sit down with the work plan, the polished work plan. If you all felt very strongly about trying to have something happen sooner, obviously the core concepts and overarching message don't rely on a 12-page or whatever it turned out to be document. That's a nice polish, but the discussion doesn't have to have that. Obviously, we've got the data points, we've got the information to have a meaty discussion. So,
yeah, I don't feel particularly, super strong on any discernible date. I would, I think if it's going to roll out in, July or August, just given people's attention spans, it may be better to delay it towards September. But I also, our experience when you're talking about global warming, probably not releasing that in the middle of a, polar vortex event or something like that, because people tend to sort of lose their perspective and don't always make the connections. So probably sometime when it's seasonally still warm, like September, as opposed to dropping it in the middle of the winter, is advantageous. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not advocating for any particular drop dead date. I just wanted to get a perspective so that it gives us a sense of sort of how to work with the material and context of some of the stuff we're doing.
Generally speaking, I would rather do it sooner rather than later. I know I've already got community groups that are interested in hearing what we've been up to and hearing updates about the process. So I'm just deferring to the early state that I think that I could have the work plan kind of finalized. But sooner in my book would be better.
The other driver, just to be potentially aware of, is there is an awful lot of infrastructure components wrapped up in the Biden infrastructure plan that have relevance to this. And so being able to create conductivity with what's going on at the federal level is also an opportunity to take advantage of sort of people's awareness, because it gives folks who are only tuning in and out of this temporarily, when they're sort of hearing the discussion happening with the infrastructure plan, and then being able to see, oh yeah, there's a local dimension to this that's relevant too, is also important. So that might, and I think most people feel like that a lot of that is going to be coming to a head around late August, early September timeframe. So something to just keep in mind. At least it would be, if it's ready to go by then, it may be that some of that could help drive making the conversation relevant.
Great thought.
Yes,
Thank you.
Steve, I was thinking the same exact thing.
Matter of fact, Madam Mayor, I was wondering also, does this line up with the Biden plan? Are we in the same kind of trajectory as the national aspect of it? So we could actually start aligning ourselves with that?
Well, I think for the infrastructure stuff, which hasn't been approved by Congress yet, there certainly was really encouraging stuff about investments in sustainable infrastructure. So yeah, we would be very much in alignment with that. And we're working with our colleagues and the Biden administration. I mean, it's been awesome. It's been a really, really nice to see that alignment. So I think there's a lot of potential there. The American Rescue Plan is a little different, and we're still, that's more associated on recovery and investments that, maybe, of course, we can try to embed sustainability measures in it, but it's also like, covering our essential workers for the extra hazard, extra challenges they've faced, and helping out people who've been displaced from work or home or had their struggles paying utility bills. So the current stuff that is getting some attention, we'll have more alignment on these efforts on the infrastructure part of it, is what I anticipate.
Thank you, Mayor.
Aaron and Ryan, if you have some things to add to that, let me know.
I think you got it right on. And there's more coming as well that we need to be prepared for. I think it's going to go pretty quick when it gets here. Everybody's going to be interested. Were there any other burning questions before we hop back into it?
Brian, the only reason why I brought that up is we were in good position when the TVA wanted to help us out with the Keene program. So if we get in alignment now, and when it's come down, if we were already set and ready, we're going to be the first people on the block. So.
Yep. Agreed, Stan. It's a great thought, and we've got a lot more infrastructure from that time thanks to great partnerships. So let's get into kind of the strategy selection and what went into choosing them. So that's centering equity. This is a similar slide. It's been in previous presentations, but I built it out a little bit to give a little bit more depth here. So the equity working group really worked hard over the past year, diving into these topics, doing surveys, having very in-depth discussions and a series of workshops where they came up with their recommendations. And we got a memo, and I want to, before I get too into that, I know that 3Cubed is also working on kind of a case study that'll be a little bit more of a long form, more packaged version of that memo, but the depth of it or the content of it wouldn't change substantially. And that this final bullet here, when we got that memo, I read through it, and anything that the equity working group rated higher, I bumped up. I deferred to items that would more prioritize the advancement of equity outcomes. And then aside from, there was one exception to things that were rated unlikely. So anything that was unlikely to advance equity outcomes as determined by the equity working group, cut. And I wouldn't worry too much about those, as we're typically lower rated through every stage of the process anyway. So there was some alignment there. I think folks were naturally gravitating towards more community benefit sort of outcomes. The one exception that I made that I wanted to be very clear about was in waste. There were concerns over residential composting. And from what I read in the notes from the workshop and assessing those, most of those concerns stemmed from the community composting model that was discussed and the placement of community composting sites in neighborhoods and the potential impacts there, not necessarily the service or opportunity to do composting, so much as the impact of where composting might be occurring next to homes. And so I made one editorial decision there and included that with the caveat that we need to unpack those concerns. And so this is how it's looking in the work plan. And tried to be very highly visual and balance that with the narrative on, for those of you that have scrolled through it, on the left-hand side, we've got the narrative of what we've done and an explanation of where folks' minds were at in terms of their recommendations, as well as I ended every section on a discussion of the items that the equity working group highlighted. So potential co-benefits or potential community positive outcomes were encapsulated leading into each ranking. And then in the rankings here, even though I didn't number them, this is the actual order that the equity working group. So you'll notice some consistency, whereas greenhouse gas emissions kind of varies throughout, time frame varies throughout. Every section starts with the highest item being considered the greatest community benefit as determined by the equity working group. And so that will kind of funnel down. And one of the discussions, we surveyed all the technical working groups throughout about how they would like things rated. So would they like transportation priorities rated against other transportation priorities, or against, for the greenhouse gas reduction relative to other transportation, or against the whole? And so every working group independently came out in favor of ranking these sort of relative scales of emission impact or time horizons as being relative to every strategy and not just sector. So when that happened, there are some sections where, relatively speaking, you might end up with a bunch of 1-star or, single icon sort of relatively low greenhouse gas, because waste strategies, when they're 4% of our total community profile, a potential waste strategy is not going to rank anywhere near the potential for vehicle electrification or net zero electricity. So just to give a little bit of information about how we ranked them, how we presented them.
Hey, Brian, could you go back for just a second?
Sure.
Walk me through the
Sure.
visuals of this. Improving bike ped facilities, has improves the emissions by 1 CO2 cloud.
Yeah.
But
So
EV adoption is 4 CO2 cloud. So it's better on emissions, on impact.
yes, ma'am. So I
And
don't
then
know
the
if you can,
clocks,
I don't know if you can see my cursor here.
we can, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So a CO2 cloud is essentially the relative impact or the relative reduction in emissions. And the data that we use to build these comes from ORNL, PNNL, NREL, all the acronyms of the national labs. So respected studies that assessed policy or markets and predicted how much you could expect either adoption or potential reduction. And we applied our numbers to those to come away with a CO2 number. And rather than giving a series of just what we felt like might be unapproachable numbers, we used a 1 to 5 scale. And so the potential for bike ped connectivity improvements to lower transportation sector emissions or greenhouse gas emissions of our entire community profile relatively low. And that one in particular, in public transit, the NREL study, I think the high abatement scenarios were somewhere in like 4% reductions. So a fairly small number relative to taking every car, making it electric, with the potential that could be low carbon electricity, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So what is the clock function or the stopwatch? What does that mean?
This was a relative time horizon that the technical working groups felt like these could be reasonably implemented or were reasonably projected to be implemented for things like whether it's near-term technology or a long-term sort of technology.
How fast you can do it. And then the
Correct.
people is how many people it would involve, or
Aaron Rose, if you'd like to chime in here, but the equity working group rated things on an unlikely, somewhat likely, and likely scale to advance equity outcomes. And they provided some detail about the potential outcomes. So this is a generalized, we call it community benefit in here, but bike ped facility expansion, pedestrian improvements generally have a greater outcome or a greater net benefit on communities. Okay. Aaron, am I representing that summary correctly for the working group?
Yeah, I think that's probably sufficient for now, and it should be fleshed out a little bit more in the case study, just in terms of those overarching equity questions that we kept in mind as we went through each of these strategies. And at this stage, again, it's pretty high level, so you can only say what you think you would expect to find in these types of activities. And then as they become more defined, I think that will become more apparent in terms of their potential benefits.
Got
And
it.
this is
Okay.
everything.
Thanks for helping me understand. I understand now.
Those are great questions. Thank you, Mayor. So priorities summarized, and we've got kind of a dual slide here. I don't want to linger too much on these since you've all seen the work plan. Trimmed them significantly and went for really where the big movers were, where the big interest and the big movers were. And when we ran the numbers and saw the equity working group outcomes, there was pretty good alignment. We did do a public survey, and this is, so when we concluded in January and we were talking about doing this public survey, and I wanted to use that to find out, did we have a big disconnect between what we were saying were priorities and what just general mass marketed sort of survey research would say. And we didn't ask them about commercial aspects. So those are rated as NA generally, but these were all top ranked. So anyone that did a write-in and they recommended something, if it fed into those, Grace and Sharth from my team manually went through every single response and attributed it to the related strategy. So if somebody wrote in that they wanted bus fares lower, we mapped it to the strategy related to public transit. And these were by and far very popular. So bike ped in particular was about 55% of respondents. It actually had the most votes of any. So we just asked folks, what's most important to you in reducing emissions? These very general, and we focused on lived experience. Do you want public transit improvements that reduce ride time, reduce fares, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had really high alignment. And I would say the write-ins, while I say we had 65 technical experts participating in this process, we had some very technical write-ins. So we had some very informed community members being very specific in their recommendations. So I feel really good about that. There's not a disconnect between what this group discussed and the priorities of people that were participating in the survey. So Stan, sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Can I just ask back to this? Given the critical, important nature of transportation, and given that, I could see how a public survey where people may not, have a deep appreciation for, how the direction of transportation is actually going in the wrong direction relative to where we need to be going and other things like that. I think clearly we're in alignment with where people are, but there's obviously a lot of basic education about the fact that transportation is moving in the wrong direction that we've got to sort of help educate. I guess the working with, and I don't have the little graphics up, but like working with commercial fleets to make a transition to electric vehicles and other things like that. I guess, Mayor, this is an area where your bully pulpit is actually quite valuable, because I think being able to, we need the surround sound of talking about transportation broadly, but we also need to sort of try to help educate and encourage the corporations and people who actually have fleets to see the importance of making these kind of decisions. And I guess I'm just sort of curious how, if there's any thought, and this may be for another conversation, because I know you want to get through a bunch of stuff today, Brian, but I just think there's got to be some thinking about how do we help people understand the significance of those clouds of CO2 and the fact that we are directionally in the wrong direction on transportation, and the fact that, yes, bike paths and the ped things make people feel good, and they do have some benefit, and they have other quality of life benefits, but they aren't necessarily really moving the needle on getting carbon out of the air. And so the question is, how do we try to broaden and deepen that conversation and help educate people, and particularly people who have, fleets that they can influence, other things like that, that it may take, again, some of the bully pulpit.
Yeah, no, I think those are some good points. When I see this, one conclusion or observation is that people want to be more sustainable without changing things without having to change too much. Like the fact that, commercial multifamily energy reductions, number 3, and just residential energy, people are like, I want to stay where I am and have a smart thermostat, because that's easier than moving into, co-housing or whatever. Same with the bike ped, but it is important to sort of try to find the alignment, because the bike ped can also help improve our health, and there's some overlapping priorities that are good to align. But I think you're right. The bully pulpit's a powerful thing, and when I see that work with commercial fleets, I think education and promotion. We did some event with Fraley Schilling, a big trucking company that's expanding here. And all they talked about when I was with them is how they're making their trucks lighter and more aerodynamic, and they they're doing it for sustainability, but mostly because it saves them money. And so to the extent that we can highlight that, going green is good fiscal policy for our private sector as well. So I'd welcome the council's thoughts on not just that we need to do that, but the best ways to do so. Because I know from my experience that carrots and praise work better than sticks and shame. So
right.
So rewarding people, I know Keep Knoxville Beautiful has the Orchid Awards, and it's a big deal, and that's historic preservation has awards. So maybe we can have recognition and honoring people for things in the sustainability realm. And that's just one small idea, but maybe there are ways we can raise that up in other ways too.
Well, maybe a mayor's climate award to and basically say we're gonna look to people who actually move their fleet significantly towards electrification.
Yeah, we can have a corporate, who actually moved the bar on emissions the most, just absolute numbers. And then we can also have awards for, neighborhood efforts that are, smaller scale, but high quality of life and sort of that sort of thing. So yeah, I like that idea.
Yeah.
Can I ask Aaron a quick question? With transportation, with the community adoption of EVs, Aaron, was there discussion among the equity working group just for that specific piece? Because the stress around electric vehicles kind of bugs me, because I know one person who has one. I feel like most people cannot afford electric vehicles. So I was just curious what the equity working group, what the discussion was, if you guys had discussion around that.
We did, and I think that's why that was lifted up as a somewhat likely to advance equity outcomes, that particular strategy, because it is possible for those, these to have some level of impact in the community, but it was not highly scored or rated because of that accessibility issue. Of course, there's potential to make, to have access with the right strategies, and we just haven't heard those yet. So it's possible, somewhat likely, yellow coded. We'll see how this moves forward and increases accessibility for the lower income communities. Does that help answer your question just in terms of how we view that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in all practical, I'm just like, well, how can it be more affordable for regular folks to be able to get an EV? I don't know how that works.
Amy,
Aaron.
I'll say one thing that, we consider, right? Since 2017, I've been working to make EV charging, at least City of Knoxville public EV charging, free. And we manage that through just effective load management to reduce the potential cost. But actually going to a non-network unit with no annual fees is actually cheaper for us to provide that electricity than it would be for us to pay for the system that would let us generate revenue because utilization was so low. So it was actually financially more beneficial to provide free electricity because we only spend about $400 across all our sites in electricity, but we were spending $5,000 in annual fees. And that's one of the ways that while we're transitioning that we can incentivize and make it a little bit more palatable is providing those sorts of amenities. So that's one way that we would consider it. Obviously, it doesn't make the sticker price on the car any lower, but it does reduce that range anxiety, especially in denser areas that may not have off-street parking. That's one thing that we heard through this process, that people without driveways or garages are really struggling to charge or even think about the logistics of owning an EV. So we need to do more to support that.
And
And
Aaron,
I think a big part of it is going to be as there is greater penetration with more vehicles actually being manufactured by the OEMs and then developing a secondary market for those vehicles. So you're going to see both the price points coming down of the original purchase as more vehicles get into the market, but then also the fact that there'll be vehicles cycled in the secondary market, used vehicles. But there's still quite a bit of education that's necessary because a lot of people still don't basically understand that there's multiple ways to save money on maintenance and fuel costs and all these other kind of things, which are actually advantageous to low income folks. And there's a lot of work trying to sort of figure out how do you do that education so that people can see the advantages there.
Great. I want to get to the next slide, but Stan, your hand is raised. So what do you got on your mind before we get to the numbers that you're asking about?
we also talked about, Aaron, with Kent, we talked about rebates for low income communities for using electric cars as well.
Thank you. Okay. So let's get the numbers, and I apologize. I didn't put a lot of these slides in because usually everyone's eyes glaze over, and I realize that I'm probably the only one having fun when we start looking at these. So to give you a little bit of idea about how we consider GHG potential, this gets to kind of the assortment of acronym-backed studies that provided the foundation for how we did our scenarios. And we took these broad buckets, we found applicable studies for whether that's bike ped sort of impacts, encouraging people to join or ride public transit, waste reduction programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we ran about 20 different iterations. We ran these individually and they just weren't accumulating into much. And what we found is really there are just two main drivers, and those are at the bottom. And so in essentially no uncertain terms, the pathway to 80% by 2050 relies on electrification of private transportation combined with decarbonization of energy systems. And when I say decarbonization of energy systems, I mean net zero carbon electricity specifically. And to some degree, depending on how much adoption of heavy duty vehicles we see, which there's still a lot of studies missing on that, that's a kind of a late bloomer in terms of data sets that we could plug in. We had to go by technical expert sort of analysis, and I used very conservative numbers because I didn't want to stick my neck too far out on that. Electrification of buildings plays into that. So kind of the two variables, you could have greater electrification of buildings, but if heavy duty vehicle electrification or hydrogen, but not a whole lot out there on the hydrogen, so we assumed electrification. Then those are two critical pieces, and that's going to get us overwhelming majority of the way there. Just currently, the roughly lumped here, which is renewables, and by that I mean net zero carbon electricity, plus electrification of transportation is like 3.5 million metric tons of CO2e, which is 64% towards our goal. So that's the lion's share of it. And then the rest kind of happens on, I'll say on the fringe, but we can't get there without those two. Let me check chat here, and I apologize. I'm juggling screens. Thank you, Liz. Yes, you have the new carbon rates. The low scenarios here for renewables in particular essentially assumes TVA hits their 2030 goal and then no progress happens. So that's the low end of the renewables. And then the greater increase is kind of the margin of making up the difference there. And that assumes that you get the net zero, which I know that you all have been pretty vocal about here recently, being aspirational towards net zero. So let me put this into chart form. This has more lines in it. I scrubbed some from the work plan because a lot of them, when it got down to that size, you couldn't really tell the difference between some of the plots. The dotted line along the bottom would be the target. I put 2030, even though we don't have a 2030 goal, but I know that folks have asked about that since even before we started this. So I wanted to just be transparent and show what that number would be. And then at 2030, you start to see a strong divergence. Obviously, that's a long time span, so that's part of it. That lowest line on your screen would be the darker green down here. And that still has a fairly conservative number for heavy duty EVs. That assumes about a 47% adoption. So every 47% of all semis essentially on the road would be electric, and that would be net zero carbon. From what I've heard, people would project that to be higher by 2050. But again, there weren't studies for me to be able to say, here's the figure. This relied on kind of the expert analysis, and they gave me, back of the napkin sort of numbers to work with. And so I'm not concerned that this line does not bisect this line by 2050, because I know that the data that would substantiate a greater number of heavy duty vehicles being decarbonized is not out. And from what I've heard, they project that to be higher. So when that number gets trued up, that's about 150,000 metric ton difference. We would more than cross that.
Hey, Brian, the inflection point that I see on that dark green line, I'm assuming that's aligning with 2030. Is that an inflection point that you're aware of why it's inflecting at that? Is that a matter of like local data based on TVA's plans, or what's driving that inflection starting in 2030?
Yeah. All of these account for growth. It accounts for, we used EIA data, so we used federal data on energy consumption trends for the past 20 years. And so we assume that sort of same growth trajectory of energy use. We also assume a pretty steady growth rate of population over that time. So things are starting to scale up in that business as usual. 2030 is very close. Obviously, one of the main wedges that starts to occur from 2030 and 2050 is the electrification of vehicles. And so EPRI, their study predicts a variety of scenarios by 2030, but their modest scenarios are low single-digit sort of adoption trends of electric vehicles. But in their light-duty scenarios for 2050, it's like 95% adoption of electric vehicles for light duty. So there's a big swing between 10-15% to 95%, which is why it looks such a dramatic shift. These central lines, if I can find my cursor here, essentially those are us making a change, but not net zero carbon. So with the investments in, we're hitting that 2030 sort of target for TVA's carbon, that assumes that stops there, and then these start to level out. These lower ones assume net zero carbon for electricity. And then kind of in between are various adoption ratios of electric vehicles and or electrification. So this, the darkest green one, I put a little bit more detail because that's the one that I'm sure everyone's mostly interested in. That's a higher heavy duty EV, which is specifically 47%. It's a 95% adoption of light duty vehicles. It's net zero carbon electricity and 90% electrification of all purchased utilities, which would be a 15 to 20% swing in residential and commercial, and based off the most recent data for industrial, probably be somewhere in the 30 to 40% swing of energy use in buildings. So relatively, I think relatively modest in terms of residential and commercial, but a pretty big swing in industrial. Does that help explain? So again, this is something that those critical points, electrification of transportation plus net zero carbon electricity, are the backbone of how we even get close to driving that wedge. And there are a lot of things that are, I don't want to minimize, they're important, and that's why they're in here, but we can't lose focus of what's going to be the main driver. So I'm going to pivot and then we'll have a pause. So let me present this really quickly. So going back, that's the previous slide with a little bit more color where I talked about kind of next steps in council. What I'd like to propose is have you all comment on what you've seen, heard, read through the rest of the week, your staffs, committees, groups, what have you. And I would ask that if there's anything that is mission critical that you just cannot live with, let me know. Otherwise, if we don't hear anything that's mission critical, like cannot live with it, what I'd like to do is start taking this public, finalize the document, start looking at when we can get on calendars. Let's get out there and talk about what we need to do to really substantially move these emissions. It's a 30-year job, we've got a lot of work over the next 30 years. I don't want to lose sight that it's a long-range goal and that these things are not going to happen overnight, but we need to start discussing it very clearly. What I would propose is let's have a next meeting, a Mayor's Climate Council meeting in November. So in that assumption, I'm assuming that we're good with the plan and the conversation with council happens before November, but that we would reconvene to talk about what's changed since, hear your thoughts. And I think I'd like to hear some partner presentations and hear from you all a little bit, or your staff in that sort of setting. And that November sort of timeframe lines up with city departments doing budget submissions. So I think that's a good time for us to kind of reconvene and visit on what's important to us and what we expect to see. And then the final thing would be between now for your final say, that May 22nd sort of timeframe. And then we'll be building out the website. I'd like to get the bones of it up over the summer and then continue to build out dashboards and metrics, and assuming that's going to be a fairly dynamic platform. Just a lot of information. I probably should put a pause somewhere in between this, but let's take a breather. And this is kind of the last little section that we're going to rally around. Does this feel right? And again, is there anything that you can't live with that you're hearing or have seen in the work plan?
Hey, Brian, it's Brian Hand. Is there any way you could put that slide up there? That's the graphic on the left, but make it big again so we could. And tell me again, what is this? This is what's going to be for. This is going to be for public consumption. This, or is this for our group? This graphic.
Public consumption. So this
Okay.
work plan would be the new sustainability work plan.
Okay.
Liz has a question in chat about why no goals in resilient communities. We didn't discuss this as part of this process. I knew that mitigation itself would be a pretty substantial lift. The equity working group, we've been actually working on funding to support them to begin some of those discussions as well. So it's next on the docket, but the 80% by 2050 was a high priority and really enough to kind of stand on its own. I didn't want it to be so dense, and I didn't feel like we could do this in a year if we tried to do adaptation and mitigation.
So Brian, just to be clear, between now and the next meeting in November, there wouldn't be any work, no project work that could benefit or burden any of the communities in Knoxville, right? So the work plan, publication, but nothing actually being implemented between now and then that would require input from this group.
You've heard the budget presentation from the mayor at the beginning, so those are already in the pipeline.
Yeah, I think one sort of exception to that is what happens if the infrastructure bill from the federal government, when it gets passed. And I would certainly welcome some input from this climate council on how we could, once we know how many dollars we're getting and what the rules are for how we can spend them, and knowing that they're, you know, from everything I anticipate there'll be one time, what those infrastructure dollars from the federal government, how we could use those most strategically. That's consistent with, to maybe jumpstart. To me, you know, the great thing is that, as we've said, is like, we're already in alignment with a lot of those things. So could we use those dollars to move forward faster? Because we have this infusion of money from the federal government that's already doing stuff that's in this work plan, or that could, yeah, like I said, jumpstart, catalyze. So I think, anticipate, that's up to Congress. I don't know how fast that's going to happen, but when that happens, we'll all hear about it, and would welcome an opportunity to maybe have a discussion about that with this group. And also, yeah, I mean, I just don't know how that money is going to be allocated, what the rules are, how much the city will get versus, the county, the state. The ARPA dollars, we love getting them, and it's great, but I mean, Knox County is getting more than double what we're getting, and so want to sort of just be aware of that as a resource as well. Not this mayor's climate council, but if we raise the discussion, and I think this goes back to what you were saying, Steve, the bully pulpit. If I can, as mayor, and with the help of this climate council, talk about how Fraley Schilling is making all these more sustainable trucks and maybe moving to electric, and this is how that saves money and creates jobs and makes Tennessee more sustainable. That could be positive, and get the same idea spread out to, because obviously the emissions affect the whole globe. They don't stop at the city boundary. So, Steve, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just want to support exactly what you're saying, and I think feedback to Brian that I think everything you want to talk about in November is great, but I concur with the mayor that I think when, let's say positively, the infrastructure bill passes, and again, I think the thinking is they're going to try to get it done before the fiscal year ends in the federal budget, which, as I understand, is the end of September. We should, know something about that, August, September timeframe. It might be valuable to reconvene with just a targeted discussion on that particular piece based on once you all get some information. The other thing is, for those of you who aren't tracking it that closely, the clean electricity standard, which is likely to be a component of it, is one of the ways to really lock in a glide path to making utilities get to zero carbon by a time certain, as opposed to just sort of the vague promises. There is money associated with incentivizing purchases of electric vehicles that are likely going to be in all types of things. So there's just a whole plethora of things that are going to be in that jumpstarts a lot of what we want to see happen. And so I would hope, I know some people can't be too political, but I would hope that people will weigh in on the debate that goes on around the infrastructure bill. Don't have big hopes that our delegation is necessarily going to end up the right way, but it still is important to weigh in on it, and I think helping educate people generally about all the advantages, and then once it passes, to convene and make sure that we're putting as much Velcro into the air to capture the money that's going to be moving out of DC into the communities, as the mayor said, is critically important, because it's a huge deal.
Brian?
Mayor, if you're fine with it, I'm certainly fine with it. So if there are any, I do want to hear if anybody has any thoughts. The anxiety in my head is like, these are too positive of things. So are there any things that folks feel like they can't live with from what they've seen or heard? Or do you just need time to digest?
Definitely need some time to digest, but Brian, what are we supposed to do between now and November? Most of that stuff is staff related.
Well, I hope you'll all come out and support projects that we've got coming out and continue working with us. I know, Stan, you're involved in this group where we're trying to continue the work of the equity working group. So the work doesn't stop, but this planning process, this visioning process, we eventually do need to button up and get to work and roll our sleeves up. And that's a space that, I'm ready to get to. I know that you all are eager from the discussion that we've had today about how we start moving the needle. So I'm going to make sure that I understand your priorities and the trajectory that we're headed on, and I'm reflecting that in how we discuss it. But I'm ready to put a bow on it and get out in the community and start finding projects.
Yeah, I think this has been a really fruitful process, and now we can move forward and finalize and adopt and communicate the working plan. And then as more funds become available, either through our local tax revenues or manna from the federal government, we can apply that to the projects and the priorities and sort of the work plan, and then consult and confer and get the benefit of this group as needed. We might, so I think we should definitely set a meeting for late October, early November, as a standing meeting, but then have an ad hoc meeting when we can't really say when, but we'll call it, and hopefully we'll find a time that most everybody can participate and have that discussion about those infrastructure dollars and how best to deploy those to make our working plan, move forward faster, because time is a wasting, and how we can move forward in a way that meets our goals and obviously adds those metrics for the equity aspects of it, all those things. So why don't we say meet in late October, early November, and let Brian and his small but mighty team try to move this working plan into, talk about how we communicate about it to council, how we communicate about it to the general public, how we, use the bully pulpit to raise the profile of what, not just what we're doing as a city, but what private sector, large fleet entities are doing. So those are all sort of not tangential, but sort of supplemental to the work plan itself, those communication strategies and so forth. So that sounds good. And we'll meet again when we have some information about the federal dollars for infrastructure. And so if you guys get it, I mean, we have a lot of well-connected people on this council. Keep us in the loop as you hear things. I mean, we're all monitoring all kinds of things about the federal government, and if you guys get some insight of things like, oh, this is going to work really well for our plan on buildings or our fleet, let's start lining that up. So let's just keep the conversation going. But we won't have a formal meeting until we get more information from the feds. But I do want to invite, as we are able to launch these things and maybe communicate about them. I certainly want your guys' involvement and engagement and ideas for how to educate the community. I mean, I talked at the beginning about how our second and third graders have been sort of saturated in this in ways that we weren't when we were growing up, but still that awareness and also helping people understand that, yes, the composting and this and that, and bike ped, that's good in a holistic way for sustainability, but also for quality of life and health. And those are important. But what are those critical things? I think you listed two that were the really big movers, Brian. And one was electrification of vehicles, and one was zero carbon energy.
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
I don't really even know what that means. Zero carbon energy, just solar, like not renewable? Is that another way of saying renewable?
Renewables, yes, ma'am.
Okay. All
Well,
right.
and I
See,
think
I need to learn too. I mean, like, I'm more savvy than some, but I need to learn more.
Non-fossil. Just think
Yeah.
you don't want to be a fossil anymore, and then you'll have clean electricity.
Okay.
And TVA, to give a shout out, I think Liz linked in that, but they have now articulated kind of that vision for 2050. And I would just want to kind of give that shout out to TVA, because I think it is important to kind of understand all the neat things that are coming down that pipe that will help them achieve that aspirational vision. It's not just solar and wind.
Yeah, Liz, that's a great, I looked at the link that you sent, and TVA's website's really good, not surprisingly, but I don't take the time to look at it that often. But yeah, I'm gonna read that report, and it looks like it's pretty easy reading, pretty friendly to the non-scientist person, just the general public. Thank you. Any
Stan,
other? Yeah, Brian?
I was just going to say, Stan, is your hand up from the previous question?
Oh, it's hand up again. I'm gonna lower it. Well, I want to agree with you, Brian. I'm ready. This is unrelated, but this is all related to me. I just left my brother's house on Louise Avenue. Somebody just got killed over there. So I got to get these young people working. So I'm willing to do whatever I need to do to help out, and I'm ready to get started, brother. So I'm with you.
Let's get together, Stan.
All right, brother.
Yeah, it's all tied together. Green jobs can be a way out of poverty and giving people hope and more sustainable. So thank you, Stan and Seed, for working on that.
Everyone, we're running up on time, I want to respect everyone's got something else to do and or go home. So we'll take this to email from here, and we'll send a follow-up. We'll make sure we reattach the work plan, and that'll come from Grace, and we'll just have that "what can't you live without" kind of simple reminder, and we'll give you through the 22nd. And we may have some follow-up if you get back with us. Does that sound fair? I'm seeing heads.
Sounds good. And when we have a plan for how to communicate the final plan, we'll make sure that you all are included in those plans, and we'll just sort of think through that. And I really, really hope our next meeting can be in person. It's been good, you know, we've gotten a lot done, but it would be nice to meet in person.
It's gonna be like a reunion / first meeting.
Exactly. So. All right, well, Brian, we'll wait for an email from you and asking for just a reminder on further feedback, and have a week to do that, and then we'll go from there. Thank you guys so much. It's been remarkably productive, and I'm excited about this work plan, and I'm excited about potential ways to make it go faster with those federal dollars. So, but we're going to work on it regardless, and it's all good in alignment. So. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.